Back in April, I was told I had no options, and it was time to go into hospice. Not too long after, my kidneys failed, and I was on dialysis, and they didn't really think that my kidneys would recover. The physician had come past my dad, to talk to me, and it's like time to pursue the hospice. And remembering that this isn't a sprint, it's a marathon, and now I can take incremental steps to rebuild my health. So my dad wasn't going to do that, and so when the doctor came in, the reason why we were looking at hospice at that time was so our son owned renal failure. I ended up being at the dialysis clinic for 2 months, and my kidneys healed. I wanted to go back and give them a thank you letter.
There we go, Will. Yeah! Are you feeling that flexibility by getting your heels down?
So my name's Will. I was diagnosed in December 2022 with stage 4 liver cancer. And I'm from Florida. It's one thing that kind of made it difficult was when I was diagnosed, I wasn't in the best mental space. I was kind of recovering from kind of a traumatic experience. And after once cancer kind of progressed and I'd been diagnosed, I actually was kind of free from that freeze response. And I noticed how tired I actually was. And then reflecting back to the prior to my diagnosis, there was a lot of tiredness that I kind of attributed to being depressed, but it was definitely much more than I'd experienced in the past. The other two things were I'd have diarrhea pretty consistently for 3 months. And then also I experienced vomiting. And it was, I attributed it to food poisoning because it was a kind of vitamin vomiting. And I also noticed it happened with particular foods. So pork or fatty things, and sometimes with chicken. But again, I always thought it was food poisoning, but it was definitely something that extended much longer back. And I always just thought it wasn't anything big. So my diagnosis story is kind of crazy. It actually happened. I was playing badminton with my best friend in November, prior to being diagnosed in December. And we'd been playing since 4th grade, and we were always fairly evenly matched. But every time I would dive for the birdie, when I fell, it really felt like my abdomen was like a rock. And afterwards, kind of days after, I was starting to get a little bit of abdominal pain, my upper right quadrant. And that's when I finally kind of decided to go to my primary care doctor. And then got checked out, if I would have a virus or something, stool samples. And then we also scheduled a CT. At the time, the CT was scheduled for the end of December. And one thing, the abdominal pain got consistently worse over the next couple of days. My father's a physician, and so I think he had an idea that something was going on, and it was kind of one of those days I wasn't realizing how tired I was consistently. But I was laying on the bed just not feeling good, but also having that abdominal pain. And my dad was coming in to follow up, and he did a abdominal. He checked my abdomen, just feeling if there's anything there, and then there was a hard spot. And I was okay, that's when we decided just to go in. I ended up, when we eventually got to the hospital, it was 10. It was a fairly busy day. They started off, they had us waiting in the waiting area, and you come in and do tests, and they just started off with blood work. Then I kind of went back to sitting. And then you come and do a CT, then you kind of go back. And then there was more blood work. Yeah. And when I eventually saw the doctor, it was 3 hours later. And I guess what they were doing was the initial idea of what I had was not liver cancer. I'm incredibly grateful to that ER doctor because you're not immediately sure that it's liver cancer until there's a biopsy. But kind of how he presented it to me was like he came in and I have bad news. Like there's a tumor I've never seen one this large before on someone's liver. It was like between 60 and 70% of the liver. And then at the time, because the thing that brought me in really was that abdominal pain. Like that was the instigator of like, okay, I need to check something out. But what was happening there was the tumor had grown so fast that it had outgrown with blood supply. And so I had to bleed. And then also there was, because it had grown so fast, there was a giant mass of like necrotic tissue. Um, and so it was like describing that. And then I also ended up fracturing my back and ribs from the abdomen. So um, it was crazy because I got that all at once. And like he also, like what I really appreciate was, he was saying this is kind of like what you might be hearing through the next couple of days. Like it's likely cancer. Because there was also a spot in my spine that was suspected of being metastasis. One thing that cancer really introduces is like that sense of uncertainty. Like often when you're starting treatments, like for other things, it's like there's a more immediacy in the action. And so they're going to transfer me. I thought it was like going to happen that morning. I mean, I was kind of, that was how it changed. And then I was kind of like over the next 3 days, it took 3 days until I found a bed. I was able to get transferred. But over the next 3 days is like, well, then they're like, the doctors are like, how does like a healthy 29-year-old get liver cancer? This has to be like a tumor. Um, I had like no risk factors to have like hepatitis or fatty liver or can't remember what the other one is, but there just was like no, it wouldn't be something you'd suspect. And so it was kind of navigating like, oh no, it's not cancer. Like it's okay. We'll just get a resection. And then like slowly get more tests and more tests. And then um, it's slowly getting to like what I had been presented with at the beginning, which was metastatic cancer. But like at that initial part, it was kind of, no, there's no way. But because I'd been thrown everything at the very beginning uh, with no phone, I mean, I to adjust to that quickly. One thing that kind of is another symptom of like liver cancer is like there's a general uneasiness, like you just feel off. And once you're starting to be confined with very acute symptoms, that's kind of coming more to the forefront of your mind. And so like now that you're taking that step to go out and advocate for there's something wrong, I want to just that needs to be addressed, and also having a physician as a father and being like, need to go. Like, I mean, I'm not 100% sure if I would have gone that day because it's hard when you are in that state of you feel vulnerable, but you don't really know why. And so, like, having others, I'm really fortunate to have like my father as a physician. I think like one thing like throughout the whole cancer journey that helps is having something that an actionable thing that I can look forward to. And I mean, at that point in stage in the cancer journey, I wasn't like at the stage of acceptance that I am now, or like how you define hope now isn't necessary. How you defined it yesterday or in the future, and like then we're kind of, what I was looking at was like, oh, all we have to do is handle like these metastases, and then and get an intersection. And that's kind of, what it helps with that initial part. I was just energized by like having that singular like, focus of making a positive impact on our community. I mean, given a guy only have a short amount of time, like being able to move forward and still do that in your time. Um, and then kind of like as cancer progresses, you kind of have to find like hope in new ways. And I think what got me through like the first like 6 months was that having purpose and like striving for that. Um, but then like when you're confronted with like in July of 2023 is when like they found out for sure the metastasis in my spine was um, was cancerous. And so that's when I had a kyphoplasty. And then at that point, you really realize uh, that this is something that there's not like a cure for right now. Um, and it's great. Like the thing that actually, when you're originally, like one of the things that I think helps with cancer is you're forced to like really sit with discomfort. And like, I mean, it sucks. Like it's a process. So like it doesn't happen at once, but like eventually just there becomes like an acceptance. And like there were things in the past and that are hard, but it's not like threatening your very existence. And like that was my reality now. Um, but like, and when he was first, when I was first diagnosed, or like, there's not anything to do like this, but it was just sort of how I've moved forward is just continue taking like whatever comes at me, and you never know what'll happen in the future. Um, this may be something like that, like there's nothing there right now, but also I could potentially survive until science is always developing. So near the know. So there's two first line kind of traditional treatments. The one's just immunotherapy and then the other one's immunotherapy and like levitinib. So I did those two. And I progressed on both. The first one I progressed in like 2 months. And the other one I progressed in like 4 months. And after I progressed through those two, there's a second line treatment, Carbo Max. It's some inhibitor. And I was on that actually only for 2 weeks. But then I got into a clinical trial. Um, and so then you have like that washout period for a month and then start on the clinical trial. So I was on the clinical trial from November to March. Um, but I kind of stopped treatment like in January when I was told. And then, I mean, I didn't have any treatment until my new one, which I got through compassion use in July of 2024. Like when I was diagnosed, I was reading like every bit of research that came out like every day. So we were always looking for clinical trials, but finding ones that you qualify is difficult. And I guess so there was just one for like my type of cancer. So I mean, another thing when you're starting to read about everything that's going on is it's really exciting of like there's a lot of like it seems like we're on the cusp of a lot of medical breakthroughs. But like what you don't realize early on is like getting access to those or like that reality of what that process involves is much more difficult than just like this is theoretically what sounds really good, it's really promising and let's go try that. But there's a lot of factors that play into that. Um, and there's a lot of parameters of so you have to make sure everything is within range. Um, and so kind of navigating that and learning more about, it's exciting of everything that's out there, but also like the reality of like, this is kind of what's available and like what I can get into right now. So when I think back to that conversation, it's actually, I mean, it's messed up, but it's like a good memory. Um, and I mean, part of it, so going into that conversation, I kind of knew what was going to happen. Um, the physician had kind of asked my dad, to talk to me, and it's like time to pursue a hospice, and my dad wasn't going to do that. And so, like when the doctor came in, the reason why we were like looking at hospice at that time was so I was starting to go into renal failure. Um, that's when I had the clinical trial drug was called in like January, and my kidneys were like failing that time. And then I was also like I had a bleed. And so at first when I came in, like, they're like, okay, we'll stop the bleed and then we'll do a kidney biopsy to find out what's going on. But then like the tumor board came back and was it's too risky to do the surgery. And then I was no longer going to be transferred to a hospital because you you're pretty much guaranteed to die if you're like bleeding and like you're going into renal failure. When I was advocating, I was like, okay, let's just transfer me for like academic purposes. Like I might not like make it through this, but let's find out what was wrong. I guess so. One thing like throughout the whole thing was, just finding one thing you can do to fight back. Just because there's so much that's out of your control. Um, like, be the cancer itself, like that's something I can't do, but like taking actionable steps of like what I can do um, is helpful. And kind of how the whole triathlon journey started was actually prior to that hospitalization when I was recommended for hospice. I had been in a kind of frozen state because everything is going wrong. You're just waiting to find out what's to do about your kidneys. I saw swimming could help, so I was like, I'm gonna go swim. And so that was the first time I did like exercise in a long time at that point. So I tried quite a few attempts and I couldn't replicate my normal, like 3-legged underwater kind of thing. But it's still a lot of fun. I mean, it kind of just emerged. Like I had that swimming experience and the swimming was important to me. And I don't know why I picked biking, but I was like, I'm going to go out and go for a bike ride. And then I went out there and I still had the dialysis tube in my, and like I was in really rough shape. And I mean, my aspiration at that point was, to bike at Fort DeSoto again. And I thought I could do it, but like I did a mile and a half to 3 miles and it was rough. But just being able to like move yourself forward and like, I mean, you start to lose a lot of independence with cancer. And biking was something that was very liberating because you have a movement. And like how I incorporated that going forward was like the first when I started to get better and better. I wanted to work the dialysis center because I mean that was the first step in kind of my recovery. And so like I made some cards me and I biked to drop them off. And like when I first started dialysis, I was so weak that like I couldn't drive. No, it was sorry, sorry. Um, I guess, and then it was a big thing. Like it was a really big thing to be able to drive again. And then like I biked there, and it was special. And then after that, I was like, well, why not? Like I'm gonna go for triathlon. The feeling of being able to bike hills again was amazing. Going up hills and running was always my favorite. And being able to actually have some strength in my, it was quite special because if you asked anyone 3 months ago if I would ever be self-propelling myself up a hill, I think the universal answer would be no. I'm a firm believer that nothing is really impossible. I mean, there are things that are highly improbable, such as me being alive right now. The one thing I was really afraid of was because I had the spinal metastasis, I had no idea like what my spine could handle. And so I was just doing swimming and biking. And swimming is like incredible for like when you're dealing with cancer just because it's really low impact. And really what I was just doing for a long time was walking in the pool. But I slowly would start biking. First time it's just so liberating biking because you really are like there's really like the freedom to like move. And like the first time I biked, I went so far I couldn't make it home. And that was like the first day I was like, okay, I'm going from the triathlon.
Cancer patient on the ice.
It came up into my mediastinum and I thought it was like blooming. And so like I just was not training, but it was still like you have in the back of the mind, like, this is still like my goal. But anyway, the first day I got done with radiation in March, I started again. And I think the big kind of lesson that I've learned is like not much has actually changed in terms of the cancer status, like since March. In December, I'm doing an in 70.3. But again, like having that mindset of knowing like there's only so much I can control, like health wise. And I just having the acceptance of like might not make it to like achieve that goal, but still look forward towards it was I think important. And it was one of the harder things. Just moving towards a goal, like when you have no control over the outcomes, hard. I still am getting my drug through compassion use. I've been on that since July of last year. Um, and since that started, my tumor volume's down 70%. My worst of my worst, well, the worst CT said like entire liver cancer, but like the worst measurements was like 28 centimeters for the primary and then like between 5 and 9 for the 5 metastasis. So it was really bad. But now all the left lobe all the right lobe is not cancer anymore, and the left lobe is completely cancer still. But kind of right now, it's stable. And the goal is like, oh, I mean, you never know what's going to happen, but like if it maintains, I might be looking at a resection at some point. But I'm still, I mean, a year of like, I mean, I've had metastases, but like the primary one has just been shrinking, and that's a really big blessing. Because you don't really see, it's pretty much as bad as you can almost get. And then like suddenly I'm healthy enough to do a triathlon. Like, I mean, that's a big change. If you have questions about something, like asking your physician, I mean, my moment of that kind of fear was when I was told like necrotic tissue early on. And, I was like, oh, yes, I know. But if like really I didn't, when I left, I was terrified. And I think that it's important to kind of acknowledge, like, if there's something that, if you have questions about something, kind of bringing it up to the physician. And also, I think preparing beforehand, before you talk to your doctor, kind of getting an idea of like, these are maybe some of the things that are bothering you. These are things that I'm curious about prior to, because like when you get in there, like, doctor's appointment can be really daunting and it can be hard to remember to like bring up and advocate the way you want it to. So preparing to have those conversations, I think, is important. No, even when things were horrible, like, you could still have some real moments of happiness, and it's not like because disease progression and like feeling worse doesn't mean you no longer can be happy. Like, I had a lot of really good memories, and like could find happiness even when, I mean, it's a shower, like sometimes, like, and that's the equivalent to like, who knows, but like, it's glorious. So I think just being able to find happiness day to day on a day-to-day basis and not defining it, how you found it before. And then, I mean, the other one, I mean, the really big one is just, I think it's important to find something to like strive towards. And like, also like having the acceptance to like redefine what that is. Because again, like that kind of plays into like hope. Like, hope is something that, I mean, it's either there or it's not. And I mean, you can grasp onto like, this is my idea of hope right now, and that's what I want, but you don't ultimately have control over that. And so just finding something to bring that, and there's always like some lightness in like the dark.